Trishna Baradia, an independent patient advocate in the UK, and I'm joined by medical expert Professor Gavin Giovannoni, Professor of Neurology, and patient representative Patrick Pulic, an independent patient advocate in Croatia. Thank you for joining us to talk about an analogy that should help people with MS and healthcare professionals to better understand and talk about disease progression, comparing MS disease progression to driving a car. But first, let's ask, why do we need to talk about MS disease progression? Gavin, maybe this is something that you could explain.
Well, I think we need to talk about it because it's an important treatment target. So when you talk about the natural history or the history of multiple sclerosis, people develop disability in two ways. We know about attacks or relapses where we get a new lesion in a particular pathway, let's say the optic nerve, and people lose vision and they recover vision. And that's what we call relapse-associated disability. But underneath that in multiple sclerosis, there is this gradual deterioration in functioning that may be independent of relapses. And we don't always pick it up, particularly early on in the course of the disease, because people have reserve, their nervous systems are able to compensate for the damage. And the other reason why we don't like to talk about it is because of the negative connotations of having progression. We do annual MRI scans, and sometimes we can see, shrinking of the brain, for example, or other signs of worsening. And we tend not to talk about it simply because we don't have any treatments at the moment to modify that process. But it's something that has to be spoken about because we have very good data now, information about the more effective therapies we have in MS. If you use them very early, you can actually modify this process. So they need to understand what it means. And they also need to understand that if we manage MS more effectively, we can actually impact on that process. So this is why I think the discussion is important.
I completely agree, Gavin. This is really why it's important to improve understanding of MS disease progression and also the ways in which people can be supported to help manage their condition. Many people with MS might be worried about disease progression, but they might find it difficult to express what they're experiencing. And also, people with MS might lack support. They might not be able to access their neurologist when they might need to, or they may not have the right support through their own personal networks. And so the reason why the MS disease progression analogy was created is to really aid those conversations between healthcare professionals, people affected by MS, and the wider MS community, as well as to raise awareness and improve knowledge around MS disease progression among people affected by MS. Patrick, I'd like to bring you in here now. What do you think?
Thank you, Trishna. And I'm wondering, why is the car chosen to be the metaphor to the analogy?
That's a really great question. The car was chosen because it's such a universal concept. There were many ways that we could draw parallels between cars and MS disease progression. The analogy really allows us to frame fundamental principles of MS disease progression, importantly, in a way that is free from scientific jargon. So really in a language that many people will be able to easily understand. So we start off by establishing that within the analogy, people with MS are the driver and their body is the car. The mechanics of the car itself allows us to talk about disease progression in terms of the effect that it can have on the body and how that impacts on everyday functioning. Through the driver, we can talk about the lived experience of MS disease progression and the emotional impact that it can have on someone's everyday life. Gavin, what do you think? Do you think that this could help you have those conversations?
I think even more than that. I mean, sure, it's a good metaphor for disease progression. It also allows you to bring in discuss reserve capacity. In other words, the analogy being if you have an oil leak, the oil can continuously leak, and only when it gets to a critical stage do you actually notice problems. The other analogy is one I use all the time, is that we see people every 6 or 12 months and we do an MOT on them. An MOT is something that has to be done every year on a car to make it roadworthy. So you take it off to the mechanic, they check it, they look under the bonnet, they fix things that they can, and they make sure that the car is roadworthy and fit for the next 12 months. So that's actually something I like to use when I discuss the management of MS with patients, because it's telling them that we need to do as much as we can to every little component of that car to optimize its functioning. And again, you can't just look under the bonnet. Sometimes you need special equipment to look under the bonnet, particularly with new motor cars. So you can actually bring in the analogy of having to do specialist investigations like MRI scans or blood tests and everything like that to test the health of the car. So it's actually a good analogy beyond progression. You can cover most of MS using the car analogy. So Patrick, what do you think? How would you like to be referred to as being a motor car?
Definitely, I agree. And at my next appointment, it will be important to talk to my neurologist and the healthcare team to know everything about my disease in the last, let's say, 6 months. Just like seeing mechanic or the neurologist, it doesn't always solve the problem or the issue, but it means that I need to talk to the mechanics or the neurologist about what's happening to my body and establish what can be done, whatever that be desires modifying in therapies or another course of treatment.
So I think it's very important that we create a narrative, a story around this, and have a consistent story to tell about the analogy. And I think this would probably bring us closer as healthcare professionals to people with the disease in terms of our understanding, or at least the discussion around the understanding of what disease progression is.
I think you're both so right, and you've made some absolutely excellent points. This is really about helping to facilitate those conversations between people affected by MS and healthcare professionals around disease progression. And as you said, Gavin, possibly around the wider aspects of MS. I'd like to conclude by just saying thanks to both of you for joining me in this discussion.